Excuse me. This is my house. Who are you?
Ma'am, stop right there. Don't move. Let go of the briefcase. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we need you to come with us for questioning.
I'm Congresswoman Ella Ashley. You're in my driveway. Do you have a warrant?
Ashley stepped onto her front porch, her fingers tightening around the handle of her leather briefcase as she reached back to pull the door shut. She didn't even have time to turn the key in the deadbolt before a shadow cut across the siding of her house. Two men in tactical vests, their faces obscured by black balaclavas, rounded the corner of her entryway with a practiced, aggressive speed. They didn't announce themselves with a knock or a greeting, they simply swarmed the small concrete landing, cutting off her path to the driveway where her car sat idling. The ICE patches on their chests were the only identification they offered, standing out in stark, white contrast against their olive drab gear. "Hands where we can see them, now," Agent Cale barked, his voice muffled by the fabric of his mask but vibrating with a forced, jagged authority. He stepped directly into Ashley's personal space, forcing her back against her own front door. Ashley didn't drop her bag. She stood her ground, her gaze level and remarkably steady, even as the second man, Agent Thorne, moved to her flank to block her descent down the stairs. She asked them clearly and calmly who they were and why they were standing on her private property. Cale didn't answer the question. He told her she needed to drop the briefcase and come with them immediately for questioning. The air on the porch was cold, and the silence of the suburban morning felt fragile, ready to shatter. Ashley told the agents that she wasn't going anywhere until she saw a signed warrant or a badge number. She reminded them that they were currently trespassing on the property of a United States citizen. Thorne let out a short, dismissive scoff from behind his mask, telling her that they didn't need a warrant for people like her in this neighborhood. He gestured toward the silver SUV blocking her driveway, its engine humming a low, threatening note that underscored the agent's impatience. Cale reached out, his gloved hand hovering just inches from Ashley's arm. He told her that she was making this harder than it had to be and that his patience was at its limit. He repeated the demand for her to move toward the vehicle, his tone shifting from an order to a physical threat. Ashley didn't flinch. She told them one last time that they were making a grave legal error and that they needed to step off her porch before the situation escalated beyond their control. Cale's eyes narrowed behind the slits of his balaclava. He didn't see a high-ranking federal politician. He saw a target he could bully into submission, and he was seconds away from proving just how wrong he was. Ashley stood her ground against the door, her back straight and her briefcase held firmly at her side. She told Agent Cale that she wouldn't be taking a single step toward their vehicle until he produced a warrant signed by a federal judge. Cale didn't reach for his pocket or a folder. He just let out a dry, muffled laugh behind his balaclava that signaled he had no intention of following protocol. He leaned in closer, his tactical vest brushing against her blazer, and told her that the rules had changed this morning. He claimed that under current administrative orders, they had all the probable cause they needed just by her being at this address. Thorne shifted his weight on the pavement below, his hand resting near his belt, and chimed in that they weren't there for a debate on constitutional law. He told Ashley that playing the lawyer was only going to make the next few hours much more painful for her. Ashley didn't raise her voice, but she spoke with a precision that comes from years of drafting the very laws they were breaking. She informed them that the Fourth Amendment didn't expire at sunrise and that their presence on her porch without a warrant constituted an illegal search and seizure. Cale's patience snapped at the mention of the law. He told her he was tired of the lecturing and that they weren't leaving without her. He made a dismissive comment about how people in her position always thought they were special until the zip ties went on. Ashley realized then that these weren't men following a mistake in paperwork, they were men who enjoyed the weight of their own boots on someone else's property. She told them one last time to step back and identify their commanding officer, but Cale just shook his head. He told her she had missed her chance to do this the easy way. Before she could react, Cale reached out with both hands, moving to grab her shoulders and spin her toward the stairs. He told Thorne to get the door of the SUV open because they were done talking. Ashley felt the rough texture of his tactical gloves catch on the fabric of her suit, the physical reality of the violation finally catching up to the verbal threats. She braced herself against the doorframe, her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that the moment his hands made contact, the agents had crossed a line from a bad stop to a federal crime that would dismantle their lives.
If you come across this video, comment telling me where you're watching from.
Agent Cale lunged forward, his gloved hand clamping down hard on Ashley's forearm with a grip that meant to bruise. The sudden jerk pulled her off balance, forcing her to stumble down the first concrete step of her porch. She didn't scream, but the sharp intake of breath was audible as she struggled to keep her footing without dropping the leather briefcase. Cale didn't let up. He used his body weight to steer her toward the idling silver SUV, his fingers digging into the fabric of her navy blazer. He told her to stop resisting and start walking if she didn't want to end up face down on the pavement in front of her neighbors. Thorne stood by the open rear door of the vehicle, watching the struggle with a bored, clinical detachment. He adjusted his tactical vest and let out a short, mocking whistle as Cale forced Ashley further into the driveway. He told her that her political attitude was a liability out here in the real world where people actually had to do work. He laughed, saying that maybe in her office she could dictate terms, but on this asphalt, she was just another person who thought they were above a federal inquiry. He warned her that the more she talked about her rights, the longer the ride to the processing center was going to feel. Ashley dug her heels into the gravel of the driveway, trying to anchor herself against Cale's momentum. She looked Cale directly in the eyes, or as much as she could see through the slits of his balaclava, and told him that this physical contact was an escalation he wouldn't be able to take back. She warned him that the moment he touched her without legal cause, he traded his immunity for a lawsuit he couldn't afford. Cale didn't flinch, he just tightened his grip and gave her another shove toward the car. He told her he'd heard enough legal jargon for one morning and that his only concern was getting her off the street before the neighborhood woke up. The physical breach was complete, and the dynamic had shifted from a verbal standoff to a forceful abduction. Thorne reached out to grab the handle of her briefcase, telling her it was time to let go of the props and face reality. He made a snide comment about how her high-ranking friends wouldn't be able to help her once the paperwork was filed and she was just a number in the system. As Cale pressed her against the side of the SUV, the metal cold against her hip, Ashley felt the heavy vibration of the engine through the door. She knew they were seconds away from forcing her inside, but she also knew that every aggressive move they made was being documented by the very technology they had overlooked. Thorne reached for the handle of the briefcase, his fingers locking onto the leather with a jerk intended to rip it from Ashley's hand. He told her to let go of the bag of lies and stop acting like her paperwork mattered more than his orders. Ashley's knuckles turned white as she maintained her grip, her shoulder straining under the dual pressure of Cale pinning her arm and Thorne prying at her property. She didn't let go. She looked Thorne directly in the eye, her voice dropping to a sharp, icy register that forced him to pause for a fraction of a second. She told him that the briefcase contained classified national security briefings that were subject to strict federal protocols and that he was currently in the process of an unauthorized breach of sensitive material. Cale let out a sharp, jagged laugh from behind his mask, telling her that he'd heard enough secret agent stories to last a lifetime. He pushed harder against her hip, pinning her against the frame of the SUV, and told Thorne to just take the bag by force. Thorne gave the leather another violent tug, his face twisting with frustration as he muttered about how much more difficult she was making things for herself. He told Ashley that national security was a big word for a suburban driveway and that he'd be the one deciding what was classified once they got to the station. He wasn't looking for a compromise, he was looking to strip her of the last piece of her professional identity. Ashley warned them that if the seal on that bag was broken by anyone without a top-secret clearance, it would trigger a mandatory federal investigation that they couldn't run from. She told them that they were moving from a simple civil rights violation into a felony involving the handling of classified intelligence. Cale didn't care. He told her that he was the law on this driveway and that the only protocol he followed was getting his targets into the back of the car. He told Thorne to use his body weight to break her grip, his eyes scanning the quiet street to make sure no neighbors were filming the struggle. The leather groaned under the tension of the three-way struggle. Thorne planted his feet and gave one final, desperate wrench, his breath coming in heavy, ragged bursts through his balaclava. He told Ashley that she was finished and that her briefcase was going into evidence whether she was holding onto it or not. He mocked the idea that she held anything of importance, claiming that people like her always tried to hide behind big titles when they were caught. As the latch on the bag strained against the force of his pull, Ashley realized that these men were so blinded by their own arrogance that they were literally prying open the lid of their own professional coffins. Ashley kept her left wrist pinned against the side of the SUV, using the agent's own momentum to mask the subtle movement of her fingers. As Agent Cale shoved her shoulder, trying to force her head down toward the door frame, she pressed the recessed button on the side of her smartwatch 3 times in rapid succession. A faint haptic vibration, no stronger than a heartbeat, pulsed against her skin to confirm the secondary silent alarm was active. The device was now a live microphone, transmitting a high-fidelity audio feed and real-time GPS coordinates directly to the command center of her executive security detail. Cale didn't notice the activation. He was too busy grunting with the effort of trying to pry her other hand off the briefcase, his face so close to hers that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath through his mask. He told her to stop fighting the inevitable, claiming that the longer she held on, the more resisting arrest charges he would stack against her. Ashley didn't respond to the bait. She knew that every word he spoke, every threat he uttered, and the sounds of the struggle were being recorded on a secure federal server miles away. She remained silent, letting the agent's aggression fill the recording, providing the exact evidence her team would need to prove the encounter was unprovoked. Thorne leaned over the top of the vehicle, shouting at Cale to just use his knee to pin her so they could get the cuffs on. He told Ashley that she was an idiot for thinking she could win a physical fight against 2 federal agents. He mocked her silence, suggesting she had finally run out of fancy political speeches now that she was facing real consequences. He had no idea that her silence was intentional, a tactical choice to ensure the transmission was clear and focused solely on their misconduct. Ashley could feel the adrenaline coursing through her, but she maintained a rigid, disciplined composure, waiting for the cavalry she knew was already on the way. The watch buzzed once more, a single long vibration that told her the signal had been received and the response team was en route. She looked at the silver SUV's tinted window, seeing the distorted reflection of the 2 masked men who thought they were in total control. She told Cale, in a voice loud enough for the watch to pick up clearly, that he had 60 seconds to release her and vacate her property before his career became a memory. Cale just laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the quiet driveway. He told her she was delusional and that nobody was coming to save her from a lawful federal stop. He was so confident in his mask and his vest that he didn't hear the distant, high-pitched whine of sirens beginning to converge on the neighborhood. Agent Thorne finally managed to wrench the briefcase away, the force of the movement nearly knocking Ashley into the side of the SUV. He didn't hesitate. He set the bag on the hood of the vehicle with a metallic thud, his gloved fingers fumbling with the heavy brass latches. He told Agent Cale to keep her pinned, claiming he was certain they'd find the contraband that would justify the morning's aggression. Thorne's breath was heavy and ragged behind his mask, fueled by the adrenaline of the hunt and the misplaced certainty that he was about to break a major case. He forced the latches upward with a sharp snap, ignoring Ashley's final warning that he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. When the lid of the briefcase fell open, Thorne didn't find drugs, illicit ledgers, or a weapon. Instead, his eyes landed on a high-security leather credential folder embossed with the gold seal of the United States House of Representatives. He pulled it out, his movement slowing as he flipped it open to reveal Ashley's official congressional ID, complete with a holographic federal watermark and a direct authorization signature from the Speaker of the House. Right next to it sat a sleek, encrypted satellite phone, the kind only issued to high-ranking officials with top-secret clearance for secure communication during national emergencies. Thorne stood frozen, the ID folder shaking slightly in his hand. The aggressive sneer that had been audible in his voice moments ago vanished, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. He looked at the photo on the ID, then back at Ashley, who was still being held against the car by Cale. Cale, who couldn't see the contents of the bag from his angle, shouted for Thorne to tell him what he'd found so they could finish the arrest. Thorne didn't answer. He reached back into the bag and pulled out a stack of manila folders labeled with bright red, classified headers, each one marked with a serial number that tracked back to the House Intelligence Committee. The color drained from Thorne's visible forehead above his mask, his skin turning a sickly, ghostly white. He realized in that instant that they hadn't intercepted a target, they had assaulted a federal congresswoman on her own property and breached a briefcase containing sensitive national security data without a warrant. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with sand. He whispered Cale's name, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp terror. He held up the congressional badge so Cale could see it, and the pressure on Ashley's arm disappeared instantly as Cale recoiled as if he'd been burned. Ashley didn't scramble away. She simply adjusted her blazer and straightened her posture, looking at the 2 masked men who were now staring at her in absolute horror. She told Thorne to put the credentials back in the bag and to step away from her property. She informed them that the satellite phone he was staring at had already established a link to her security details encrypted server the moment the bag was forced open. Thorne looked at the phone, seeing a small green LED blinking steadily, and realized that every word they had said, every shove, and every mockery had been transmitted to a room full of people who had the power to put them in prison. The contraband they were looking for was actually the evidence of their own professional suicide, and the quiet of the suburban street was about to be shattered by the arrival of the very laws they had spent the morning breaking. The scream of sirens didn't start as a distant hum, it arrived as a wall of sound that swallowed the quiet suburban street in seconds. Agent Cale was still standing with his hands half-raised, his fingers twitching in shock, when the first black and white cruiser swerved onto the curb, blocking the exit of the silver SUV. Before the dust could even settle, 3 more unmarked black Suburbans tore across Ashley's manicured lawn, tires churning up the sod as they screeched to a halt in a jagged semicircle around the driveway. Doors flew open with a synchronized mechanical thud, and the morning air was suddenly filled with the sharp, rhythmic shouting of men who actually knew how to handle a perimeter. Federal marshals. Drop the weapon. Hands up. Get on the ground now. The commands were deafening, echoing off the front of Ashley's house. Cale and Thorne froze. Their tactical vests and masks, which had served as tools of intimidation just moments ago, now looked like targets. At least a dozen rifles were trained on them, the red laser dots of the marshals' optics dancing across their ICE patches and balaclavas. A local police officer, his face flushed with the urgency of a high-priority dispatch, hopped the low hedge and took cover behind the agent's own SUV, his sidearm leveled directly at Thorne's chest. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been vaporized. The agents were no longer the hunters, they were two unidentified armed men who had just assaulted a protected federal official. Ashley stood perfectly still in the center of the storm. She didn't move toward the marshals, and she didn't try to explain. She knew the protocol. She watched as a lead marshal, a man she recognized from the Capitol detail, moved toward her with a high-ready stance, his eyes scanning the two agents for any sign of a draw. He shouted for Cale to move away from the congresswoman, his voice carrying the weight of a man authorized to use whatever force was necessary to clear the area. Cale, his bravado completely extinguished, began to back away with his palms flat and visible, his knees shaking so violently they were audible against his nylon tactical pants. "I'm federal. I'm ICE. We're on a task force." Thorne screamed, his voice cracking into a desperate, high-pitched plea as he saw the marshals closing in. "I don't care if you're the Pope," the lead marshal roared back, never lowering his weapon. "You're on private property, you've got no warrant on file, and you're touching a high-security asset. On your face. Now." The local police didn't hesitate. Two officers moved in from the flank, one of them kicking Thorne's legs out from under him while the other forced Cale down onto the gravel. The sound of Thorne's face hitting the driveway was dull and heavy. They didn't use the gentle, cautious approach the agents had expected from fellow officers. They treated them like any other armed suspects who had breached a high-profile residence. The agents' arms were wrenched behind their backs with a brutal efficiency, the metal clicks of the handcuffs sounding like a final verdict in the morning air. Ashley finally stepped forward, her heels clicking on the pavement as she walked toward the lead marshal. She told him that the briefcase on the hood of the car had been compromised and needed to be secured immediately under Title 18 protocols. The marshal nodded, signaling his team to bag the evidence while he stepped between Ashley and the prone agents. He asked if she was injured. Ashley adjusted the cuff of her navy blazer, her eyes fixed on Cale, who was now weeping softly into the dirt. She told the marshal she was physically fine, but that she wanted a full report on the identity of every person involved in the unauthorized surveillance of her home. The neighborhood was now fully awake, with residents peering through curtains and standing on porches, watching the two men who had tried to play God being dragged toward the back of a police transport. The ICE labels on their backs looked small and insignificant under the bright, flashing lights of the real authorities. As Thorne was hoisted up, his mask was ripped off by a marshal, revealing a face twisted in a mixture of rage and sheer, soul-crushing realization. He looked at Ashley, hoping for some shred of professional courtesy, but he found only the cold, distant gaze of a woman who was already mentally drafting the legislation that would ensure he never wore a badge again. The lead federal marshal handed Ashley the encrypted satellite phone he had recovered from her briefcase. The screen was already glowing with an incoming high-priority patch from the Department of Homeland Security. Ashley didn't hesitate, she swiped the screen and tapped the icon for the external loudspeaker. The driveway, still chaotic with flashing lights and the sounds of radio chatter, went suddenly quiet as a deep, resonant voice filled the air, the kind of voice that only comes from the top tier of the federal government. "Congresswoman Ashley, this is Secretary Miller," the voice boomed, clear and sharp. "My office just received the live feed from your distress signal. Tell me you're safe." Ashley looked down at Cale and Thorne, who were pinned against the asphalt by the marshals. Their masks had been pulled off, revealing two men who looked less like elite agents and more like panicked amateurs. She told the secretary that she was physically unharmed, but that she was currently standing in her own driveway watching two of his officers being detained after a warrantless assault and a breach of classified legislative materials. She didn't use hyperbole, she simply stated the facts of the encounter, her voice steady and clinical. There was a 5-second silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that precedes a total collapse. Then the secretary asked for the badge numbers of the agents on the scene. The lead marshal leaned down, gripped Cale's tactical vest, and read the serial number off the Velcro patch into the phone, followed by Thorne's. "Agents Cale and Thorne," the secretary's voice returned, now cold enough to freeze the blood in their veins. "I hope you can hear me. You are hereby relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Your security clearances are revoked. Your department credentials are voided. You are to be transported to the nearest federal detention facility to be interviewed by Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice. Cale let out a choked, desperate sound, his face pressed into the grit of the driveway. He tried to shout that they were just doing their jobs, that they thought she was someone else, but the secretary cut him off. He told them that their jobs required a basic understanding of the Constitution they had sworn to uphold. He informed them that by the time they reached the holding cell, their names would already be purged from the active duty roster. He then apologized to Ashley, promising her a full, transparent investigation into how such a radical breakdown of protocol had occurred on his watch. Ashley thanked the secretary and ended the call. The silence that followed was heavy. Cale and Thorne were hoisted up by the local police, their movements limp and defeated. The badges they had used as shields were now evidence tags in a plastic bag. As they were led toward the transport vans, Ashley watched them go, not with a sense of triumph, but with a grim understanding of the work ahead. She told the lead marshal to ensure the body camera footage from both men was mirrored to her office immediately. She wasn't just interested in their firing, she was looking for the paper trail that had given them the confidence to step onto her porch in the first place. Ashley didn't wait for the morning news cycle to catch up. She took the raw, unedited footage from her doorbell camera and uploaded it to every major platform before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. The video was jarringly clear, capturing the moment Agent Cale's hand clamped onto her arm and the exact second Thorne's mocking whistle cut through the quiet air of her driveway. By noon, the clip had 40 million views. It wasn't just a local story anymore, it was a national referendum on the limits of federal power. Ashley stood on the steps of the Capitol later that afternoon, not as a victim, but as a catalyst, using the momentum of the public's outrage to introduce the Home Sanctity and Accountability Act. She told the huddle of reporters that if a high-ranking member of Congress could be physically assaulted on her own porch by masked men without a warrant, then no citizen in the country was truly safe. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of people began sharing their own stories of similar encounters, but none had the high-definition proof or the political leverage that Ashley possessed. She spent the following weeks in committee rooms, playing the audio from her smartwatch, the sound of Cale's grunting and Thorne's dismissive laughter, over and over for her colleagues. She made sure the public heard the fear in the agents' voices when they realized they had caught a politician instead of a defenseless target, highlighting the hypocrisy of their standard procedure. In a federal courtroom across the city, the fallout for Cale and Thorne was moving with a speed rarely seen in the justice system. They weren't just facing internal reprimands, they were being prosecuted for civil rights violations under the color of law and the unauthorized handling of classified intelligence. Stripped of their tactical gear and balaclavas, they sat at a defense table in cheap suits, looking small and ordinary. The Department of Justice, pressured by the viral nature of the case and Ashley's relentless oversight, refused to offer a plea deal. The prosecution presented the doorbell footage as Exhibit A, proving that the agents had never once asked for identification before resorting to physical force. The shocking backlash the headlines talked about wasn't just a few days of angry tweets, it was a fundamental shift in how the agency was forced to operate. Ashley's bill moved through the House with bipartisan support, fueled by the undeniable evidence that the current system encouraged rogue behavior. She visited Cale and Thorne's former field office, not for a photo op, but to personally oversee the implementation of new, mandatory warrant verification protocols. She told the new director that her experience in the driveway was a gift to the agency, a chance to purge the culture that allowed men like Cale to think they were above the law. As the trial reached its verdict, Cale and Thorne were found guilty on all counts, their careers not just crashed, but incinerated. Ashley watched the sentencing from the front row, her navy blazer the same shade as the one she'd worn on her porch. She knew the work wasn't finished, but as she walked out of the courthouse, she checked her smartwatch. It was no longer a silent alarm, it was a tool she had used to dismantle a legacy of abuse. She had started the day as a politician who relied on the letter of the law, but she ended it as the woman who had forced the law to finally look itself in the mirror.
If you believe that federal agents must be held to the same laws they enforce, and that civil rights apply to everyone regardless of their position, subscribe and turn on notifications tomorrow. We're bringing another story that proves documentation and courage can bring down even the most powerful people who think they're untouchable.